The brain that changes itself. Chapter 5, Midnight Resurrections. Stroke victims learn to move and speak again. Michael Bernstein, MD, an eye surgeon and tennis buff who played 6 times a week, was in the prime of life at 54 and married with 4 children when he had an incapacitating stroke. He completed a new neuroplastic therapy, recovered, and was back at work when I met him in his office in Birmingham, Alabama. Because of the many rooms in his office suite, I thought he must have a number of physicians working with him. No, he explained. He has a lot of rooms because he has a lot of elderly patients, and instead of making them move, he goes to them. These older patients, some of them, they don't move so well. They've had strokes, he laughed. The morning of his stroke, Dr. Bernstein had operated on 7 patients, doing his usual cataract, glaucoma, and refractive surgeries, delicate procedures within the eye. Afterward, when Dr. Bernstein rewarded himself by playing tennis, his opponent told him his balance was off and that he wasn't playing his usual game. After tennis, he drove to do an errand at the bank, and when he tried to raise his leg to get out of his low-slung sports car, he couldn't. When he got back to his office, his secretary told him he didn't look right. His family physician, Dr. Lewis, who worked in the building, knew that Dr. Bernstein was mildly diabetic, that he had cholesterol problem, and that his mother had had several strokes, making him a possible candidate for an early stroke. Dr. Lewis gave Bernstein a shot of heparin to keep his blood from clotting, and Dr. Bernstein's wife drove him to the hospital. During the next 12 to 14 hours, the stroke worsened, and the entire left side of his body became completely paralyzed, a sign that a significant part of his motor cortex had been damaged. An MRI scan confirmed the diagnosis. Doctors saw a defect in the right part of the brain that governs movement on the left side. He spent a week in intensive care when he showed some recovery. After a week of physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy in the hospital, he was transferred to a rehabilitation facility for 2 weeks, then sent home. He had 3 more weeks of rehabilitation as an outpatient and was told his treatment was finished. He had received typical post-stroke care, but his recovery was incomplete. He still needed a cane. His left hand barely functioned. He couldn't put his thumb and first finger together in a pincer movement. Though he was born right-handed, he had been ambidextrous, and before his stroke could do a cataract operation with his left hand. Now he couldn't use it at all. He couldn't hold a fork, bring a spoon to his mouth, or button his shirt. At one point during rehab, he was wheeled onto a tennis court and given a tennis racket to see if he could hold it. He couldn't, and began to believe he'd never play tennis again. Though he was told he'd never drive his Porsche again, he waited until no one was home, got into a $50,000 car, and backed it out of the garage. And I got down to the end of the driveway, and I looked both ways, and I was like a teenage kid stealing a car. And I went to the dead end of the street, and the car stalled. The key is on the left side of the steering column in a Porsche. I couldn't turn the key with my left hand. I had to reach across and turn the key with my right hand to get the car started, because there was no way I was going to leave the car there and have to call home and tell them to come get me. And of course my left leg was limited, and pushing the clutch was not easy. Dr. Bernstein was one of the first people to go to the Taub therapy clinic for Eric Taub's constraint-induced movement therapy when the program was still in its research phases. He figured he had nothing to lose. His program with the constraint-induced therapy was very rapid. He described it. It was unrelenting. They start at 8 o'clock in the morning, and it is nonstop till you are finished at 4:30. It even went on at lunch. There were just 2 of us because it was the initial stages of the therapy. The other patient was a nurse younger than I, probably 41 or 42. She'd had a stroke after a baby, and she was competitive with me for some reason. He laughs. But we got along great, and we sort of fed off each other. There were a lot of menial tasks they would have you do, like lifting cans from one shelf to the next, and she was short, so I'd put the cans up as high as I could. They washed tabletops and cleaned lab windows to engage their arms in circular movement. To strengthen the brain networks for their hands and develop control, they stretched thick rubber bands over their weak fingers, then opened them against the resistance of the band. Then I'd have to sit there and do my ABCs, writing with my left hand. In 2 weeks, he'd learned to print and then to write with his afflicted left hand. Toward the end of his stay, he was able to play Scrabble, picking up the small tiles with his left hand and placing them appropriately on the board. His fine motor skills were coming back. When he got home, he continued to do the exercises and continued to improve, and he got another treatment, electrical stimulation on his arm to fire up his neurons. He is now back at work running his busy office. He is also playing tennis 3 days a week. He still has some trouble running and is working out to strengthen a weakness in his left leg that wasn't fully treated at the Taub Clinic, which has since begun a special program for people with paralyzed legs. He has a few residual problems. He finds that his left arm doesn't quite feel normal, as is typical after constraint-induced therapy. Function returns, but not quite to its former level. Yet when I had him write his ABCs with his left hand, they looked well-shaped, and I never would have guessed he'd had a stroke or that he was right-handed. Even though he'd gotten better by rewiring his brain and felt ready to return to performing surgery, he decided not to, but only because if someone were to sue him for malpractice, the first thing the lawyers would say is that he had a stroke and shouldn't have been operating. Who would believe that Dr. Bernstein could make as a complete recovery as he had?